Yeah.
And before that, I was
Okay.
Go there. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, God.
Good.
I'm so sorry. Did you need me to make any announcements of dessert? Are they just going to put it out? Okay, put it out. Okay. I didn't know if you needed me to say anything. Okay.
But you
Took what?
so you do what, so 4 years or 3 or 4 years out?
No, I have Scott's.
Back, or you don't have that rotation?
Yeah, Scott said it was for this one. Here comes another one. Right.
Okay,
Yeah,
gotcha.
right.
So I thought they returned it back down. So what we could do is you could just kind of stick it if you want, and then we'll just clip it right here. So let me see. I mean, they know what to say. It's just be careful what you hear and not do that.
Yeah, it's not the first time I've heard that.
Yeah. We have very similar here.
Yes.
Okay, so
Excellent. Okay, great. Anyway, yeah, I'd worked in Washington for 14 months before 2016. I've been like learning languages, but I hadn't worked in the State Department. So, yeah, I like the overseas part of the.
All right, well,
Yeah,
thank
I
you. Is this on? I don't know. Is it on?
Nope.
Not yet. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Now is it on? Yeah, there it is. Thank you, everyone. If you could take your seats, dessert is being served. And most importantly, this is always everyone's highlight of their Aspen Forum time here, which is the international panel. We probably could not have been set up any better than this morning, and particularly the keynote speech we just heard, that all the things that are being done domestically have an either implicit or explicit international focus, either as a driver or as something that has profound global consequences. We've got a terrific panel, as always, hopefully reasonably diverse in its views. We're going to, as is usual for panels that I'm involved in, I've asked each of the panelists to give very brief opening remarks, and then I will do a series of questions with each one, and then we'll be opening up for you all, if we have, assuming we have time, for your questions. I'm particularly thrilled that we have Jennifer Bachus with us today for a number of reasons. First of all, she hasn't been here before. Second is that one of the major events in the past year or so was the creation of a new bureau at the State Department that is extraordinarily important to all of our lives, whether you know it or not, focusing on cyberspace, including cybersecurity and other related issues. And what's particularly important in my mind about the new bureau is that it allowed for a senior foreign service officer, in this case Jennifer, to take a senior position in that bureau to make sure that the technology related issues that we all have been discussing are fully integrated in diplomacy across the State Department. No more stovepiping and other excuses. We now have a fully integrated approach. So I've asked Jennifer to give a few opening remarks, and then we'll take it from there. Jennifer?
Thanks. So I recognize that we are the only thing between you and the gorgeous mountain that those of us sitting up here now get to stare at. While we talked about longer remarks, I'm going to try to keep this relatively brief because I think everyone would like some time off. I think, so looking at the title of the panel, what does a revitalized transatlantic partnership mean for tech policy? And I think the part to start about is that in order for us to be successful, those of us that have a vision for the open, interoperable, secure, and reliable internet, which is the basis on which we have had US foreign policy for decades now, we can't do it alone. We, the United States, cannot go it alone. We have to do it in coordination and collaboration with like-minded partners, first and foremost around those Europe. So what does that look like in practice? Well, I think you should step back and say, of course, we don't agree on everything with Europe. In fact, I will tell you, we do raise issues around European digital regulations. Sadly, for many Europeans, a lot. We express our concerns, we have working groups, we push them, we talk about areas where we think are protectionist that are designed to keep US competitors out of the market. All of this is part of really an ongoing dialogue. It's one of the reasons why the Trade and Technology Council was founded several years ago, was the idea that we need to have a firm basis, that while we share the same values, many times we go about them in different ways. And what I found fascinating about this morning is it just underscored what I always like to say. Just because we in Europe do things differently, we approach them differently, us with the bottom up, you've got to have innovation, Europe more so top down, doesn't mean that either of us are inherently wrong. We're just approaching this in different ways. So through the TTC, we're trying to come together around some shared priorities to try to harmonize, to try to see what's possible. And then what do you do? Because that's great, we can talk all of we want, but also we go this step forward. Where can we collaborate and work together? This has been particularly important on one of the big focuses of the US government for about the past 5 years, which is this question of trusted suppliers and exactly what companies you have in your wireless networks, specifically our concerns about Huawei and ZTE. So this is something, of course, the US has taken some very significant steps to pull PRC equipment manufactured out of our networks, but we believe that this is important around the world and not just in the United States. So when we're talking about this, we find that it's most effective if we do it in close collaboration and coordination with our European colleagues, whether it's with the EU missions or the Finns, the Swedes, others. We have to go in and work on this together. So as you saw over the last couple of TTCs, we've talked about specific countries where we're trying to work together on these issues. But it's also important, essentially, when you're talking about what are the foundations that we're looking at for the future of telecommunications policy. So whether it's coming together around a shared candidate for the head of the ITU, or, and this is not necessarily the group, but I'll just mention, we're doing a lot of work around cybersecurity and specifically the framework of responsible state behavior in cyberspace and what's next, which is essentially, it was a French proposal called the Program of Action which the United States is now backing. It's just to give you a couple of examples of what does it mean when the United States and Europe come together so that essentially we can go out and we can talk to African countries, Asian countries, et cetera, and say, look, we may not agree on everything, but we share these values and we come together because we think it's important that the internet continues to operate in the way that we see, that people have meaningful access to information and connectivity. So I'll just sort of stop there, happy to riff off some other things, but I'll turn it over to my European colleague.
Actually, I get to go next.
Okay.
I get to go next.
Sorry.
There are certain advantages of being the moderator, not many. Jennifer, let me ask you a couple of follow-up questions, since you just invited follow-up questions. When you have these meetings with our European colleagues and friends, is the primary focus, or maybe you can talk about the various types of focuses that you have. One type of focus would be opening up European markets for US enterprise and for other issues. Second would be opening up the US to European companies for investment, particularly in light of recent legislation with subsidies and so forth that are being offered, the Buy America, things of that nature being part of that. And the third you also mentioned is coordinating in terms of dealing with the rest of the world, either bilaterally or in the context of the United Nations or the ITU or elsewhere. How do you divide up your time and what is the primary focus of those discussions?
So you have the question of the focus of my time, the focus of my boss's time, and then the sort of working level time. And all of those are going to be a little bit different. And it's sort of, I would also say it really depends on the timeline. So clearly, as you're leading up to TTC conversations, you tend to sort of get a little bit more focused on things like European digital regulation, making sure we understand where things are at, making sure that the right people are saying the right things at the right time, including us. You know, it depends on, you know, our travel schedules, things like that. In terms of European investment in the United States, that is not a big focus of our Bureau or the State Department. That's really more a Commerce Department focus. I would say, of course, we're working on the questions and we're following, whether or not, for example, Nokia and Ericsson can access EXIM and DFC financing, which is based on some new legislation. But that's not where we spend most of our time. And what was working in third countries. Well, again, that's, I would say, that's where we spend, the first and the third is probably where we spend most of our time, both my time, I would also say, a number of other officials from the US government.
Well, let me follow up on that third group, the UN, and we've already touched on the upcoming WRC, World Radio Communications Conference. It's coming up in November, which everyone recognizes is very important. Are we coordinating very closely with Europe on a transatlantic basis as we prepare for that?
I would say that we have communicated very clearly to Europe our positions, the ones that we've taken, to be clear. We don't have positions on all the various spectrums, but the ones that we have, particularly no change on 6G. Where we've coordinated much more closely, to be honest, is CTEL, because that's where we put forward the proposals. I would say, so we have coordinated with Europe, but while this is a European-focused panel, I would say we've also been actively going to all of the regional groupings. There was just one in Cameroon. We were there and talking about, again, our positions, because it's a ground game. What you learn in the ITU is every vote matters, whether it was to get Doreen elected or whether it's where the spectrum ends up after WRC. So there is, of course, coordination with Europe, but I would say there's also lobbying that's going on in sort of every place where there's a vote.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And by the way, for those who don't know, CTEL is the organization for the Americas that coordinates on various positions. Wolfgang, I'm going to ask you to go next to give us somewhat European perspective.
Well, thank you, David. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, now, another wind. I'd like to start with some remarks about the luncheon speech, which I very much liked. I couldn't agree more in most of the fields, and especially in the 6 gigahertz field. I was just talking to my neighbor over lunch that we have an issue still in Europe with 6 gigahertz, and the US unfortunately have already found a solution which is not, I think, the right solution. I think he was very right about licensed spectrum. This is key. There was one thing missing when he was talking about the underinvestment in Europe, which definitely exists. It is partially because of MVNOs, but the major reason is how we distribute spectrum. In Europe, spectrum every 15 years is re-auctioned. And take a country like Germany, my home country, in the past 20 years, we spent $120 billion for spectrum. Yeah? The big thing in the US is spectrum is property, also accounting-wise. And that's a big, big advantage. I mean, China is nice. I mean, they get it for free, but that's a state economy. So I think the US has made a lot of things right. And this is why Deutsche Telekom is such a proud investor and a happy investor in the US. And maybe not all of you know, we own 51% of T-Mobile, and we keep investing. And that is another field of disagreement. I think T-Mobile is over-investing still. And the reason for that is Deutsche Telekom's key strategy, wherever we invest, is always having the best network in the country. And I think T-Mobile already managed to get that, but in order to be the leader in the market, you keep investing. So that's the only slight difference I have with my previous speaker. Coming to US-European relations, I mean, we should celebrate one thing. Europe and the US managed to get a completely different leadership at the ITU. We now have an American president, General Secretary, with the help of Europe, and after many years of Chinese and Russian dominance. Even the conference main conference room in Geneva is called Salle Lavrov. I think that was a big success. But of course, we noticed there's disagreement on certain fields, and we might come to that in the discussion. I think there's one thing I also wanted to mention, and that was Open RAN. I think the US and Europe are both pursuing here the same goals. And I disagree with my previous speaker. It is something big mobile companies embrace. And especially in Europe, and we as Deutsche Telekom, but also others like Vodafone, are fully behind that concept. And we are putting an awful lot of money into it. And we also start deploying the first O-RAN networks next year together with Nokia in Germany. So we think it's a concept, it's demanding, it's indeed system integration, something mobile operators don't like particularly, but it will come.
Thank you very much. And just to follow up on Wolfgang's comment about Doreen Bogdan-Martin's election, it should be noted not only was Europe very active in ensuring that she got elected, but the elected deputy Secretary General of the ITU is a European. So there's lots of opportunities for that. And I would note that the newly elected head of the standardization is Japanese. So you see a sea change happening there as well. Wolfgang, maybe you could talk a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, as an operator, when you look globally, how important is the relationship between the United States and Europe, not just as an investor in both places, but also in terms of the issue about what the future looks like? Is it a Chinese-based future or some other, or is it going to be a more Western future? Do you see that relationship being an important part of that?
Well, I mean, for Deutsche Telekom, the answer is crystal clear. It's Europe, American, nothing else. Because we are only invested in European countries and in the US. And what we observe for now several years, of course, is these not decoupling, but the European call it de-risking, but it's a division. And I'm not sure whether we manage in 6G a common standard. I think there are, again, trends of decoupling and a lot of geopolitics coming in. And Europe is somehow in between. So that refers to some of the technologies, of course. We still operate with Chinese partially in our networks, only partially, of course. And that will be, at least until O-RAN is flying, the case. But overall, I think the economies are still so intertwined, and we are so much dependent on each other technologies that this is an overall trend. I hope it's not a division of the world again. I mean, I grew up in the Cold War, so let's see.
Very good. Thank you. Meredith, let me turn to you next and give your perspective.
Okay, great. I guess I would differ a little bit in the EU tech policy and how much impact the US is having at this point. And I think we're really in a position of being ourselves a bit disorganized interagency with Congress, with our interagency process, in the sense that we're right now really passive recipients of EU technology regulation. You've seen huge iterations of law and regulation, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Market Act, the Data Act, the new iterations of the AI Act are coming down. And the US is kind of scrambling to sort of understand what's in these things, ask some questions, but you don't see in EU tech policy what you see in every other kind of discriminatory regulatory policies out there that the US has handled historically and traditionally, you know, whether it's a precautionary principle problem in agriculture or something where you've got an interagency process, you get a position, and then the US negotiator, very much empowered, goes to the foreign country and said, this discriminates against this. This is not the least trade restrictive way to get this result, et cetera, et cetera. And those are just the broad trade policy principles that U.S. negotiators are used to applying to some of these market access barriers. And because it's a new evolving sector, these things are so complicated. The EU is so capable in iterating regulation. And the U.S., for its part, is much more hands-off and innovative and not regulating at this point. We're just facing an onslaught of EU regulation, and so they're going to be setting the stage globally, I think, and our companies will learn to love it, and they're going to have to learn to accept it, because we've done some just general assessments of the cost and impact on U.S. exports, and they're very costly impact so far on the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. So I guess I would just want to reiterate that we need a better process for engaging toe-to-toe with the Europeans before their regulations become final, because that's where actually Europe could benefit too. And the last point I would make would be that Europe is having difficulty reaching economic growth compared to the U.S., and we don't know all the different reasons for it, but I was just reading in the Wall Street Journal last month. These are just astonishing figures to me. Economic growth in the Eurozone economy was 6% over the past 15 years, compared with 82% for the US. And at some point, Europe is going to have to stop and think, maybe we could learn a little bit from the US and just waiting to see where the problems are, waiting before we charged in with a lot of heavy-handed regulation, because the contrast in economic growth is so huge. But I leave that as something that we probably can't verify, but it's a question, and I think both Europe and the U.S. do better by arguing and defending our regulations to each other, or in our case, our lack of regulations. But Europe would do well to do assessment impacts and so forth of its regulation and the potential impact on innovation before it goes headlong into legislating in a lot of these areas.
So let me follow up a little bit with that, Meredith. And those numbers are pretty substantial. We've seen that in a number of the growth difference between Europe and the United States over the past. Some statistics I saw was from 2008 on. Some have been from more recent. But it is a very substantial, and not all associated with the UK leaving the European Union as well. But let me follow up a little bit. There are negotiations going on, WTO and related trade negotiations that include tech. Is that a forum where these things can be worked on collectively between the United States and Europe? Or are the differences too substantial and everyone has to continue to go their own way?
Well, I think the overall trade picture with Europe is complicated and is potentially uncertain and could result in a lot of friction and potential retaliation, mainly due to our different approaches in carbon neutral environmental trade remedies that both sides are kind of investigating. Europe is going to put in place a CBAM, I think, in an assessment on carbon content of imports. It's going to affect a lot of U.S. exports. So that's a flashpoint. The U.S. is trying to get the Europeans to agree to a global steel and aluminum arrangement. I think it's called the GASA agreement. But that's due at the end of November, although we don't know whether there'll be an agreement. And there's just absolute opposition in how you handle the environmental problems. So that's an area of potential friction. There is potential friction on the Digital Services Act. Both of us are concerned about the expiration of the moratorium on electronic transmissions in the WTO. That's where we have a common ground. But if you look at overall on the bilateral trade relationship with the EU and you try to fit the technology policy in there, we're not spending much political capital on the technology policy. Most of it is on these other more traditional trade-related matters.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much. Peter, that sounds like a good segue for you.
Thank you. Thanks to TPI for inviting me as well. I feel a little exposed as one of the only European public sector speaker here. but I will resist the temptation to sort of respond to some of the jabs and jibes earlier in the morning and try and stick to the main question, which I think is very well formulated. And I want to break that question down into sort of four component parts. Firstly, I don't think we should underestimate the fact that there is a partnership. Go back 20 years, 30 years, and see the sort of antagonism that there has been historically between European countries and the emergent European Union and the US. The fact that there is a transatlantic partnership, embodied partly through the Trade and Technology Council that Meredith hinted at and that Jennifer was mentioning earlier. The fact that there is a partnership, I think, is already a good thing. But unbundling that even, we should recognize that partnership is not just US federal government and the EU executive as embodied by the European Commission. It's between Congress and the European Parliament. It's between the US government and individual member states of the European Union. There's a significance there, which I may come back to. It's between state governments and polities within the United States and individual countries in the European Union. Remember that California, taken on its own, is what, the 7th or 6th largest, it would be the 6th largest economy in the world. So it's a state that many member states of the European Union want to do business with directly. And the fact that there is this depth and breadth of partnership, I think, is already the first significant thing. The second point in the title of the question is it revitalized? I think it is revitalized. Those of us who are around in the policy space sort of 10 years ago remember TTIP. Remember the grand idea of this enormous trade deal between the US and the EU. And I think many of us have got the bruises and scars still from how some of those negotiations went south. And the problem, of course, with TTIP, as with many trade negotiations, is nothing's agreed until everything's agreed. It's a bartering, trading agreement, and that's what it's about. I give up my desire for this if you give up yours on the other side, which we don't agree with. It's nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. What was clever, I think, about the TTC was that they decided to have a much more project-focused approach, where they would say, we can make clear wins in specific areas, which may be of marginal significance at the time. Things like export controls, which suddenly, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, suddenly became one of the biggest issues that was being handled by TTC. TTC, opportunistically and for all the best reasons, had all the right people in the right room at the right time to be able to have a coordinated transatlantic response to Russia's aggression in Ukraine. We've seen that not just in export controls, we've seen that in areas of cybersecurity cooperation, we've seen that in the areas of supply chain vulnerabilities, which were highlighted by following Russia's invasion and also complicated by COVID. We started to see certain strategic issues that we all benefit from cooperation on. So yes, it is revitalized. The third point I'd make is maybe some examples of cooperation. I mentioned Ukraine, but we've got an agreement at a very high level within TTC on AI principles. And it's not because the EU sort of beat on the US government to accept their point of view. There was a consistent work done over many months in a dedicated working group to look at how we can work together on things like that. Outside of the TTC, there's a body called the Cyber Dialogue, which I'm sure you're very much more well-versed in than I am, but which is looking at various issues around cybersecurity policy, security threats, internal and external, as well as sort of baselines for security of our respective systems and cooperating in information exchange. There are, I mentioned supply chains. There's also, cooperation between the US government and the Commission within TTC on clean energy technologies, not in the details of what one party may want in terms of the policies, but at least trying to get an understanding that there needs to be some common basis of which you can cooperate together. And this brings me to a point that I think it was Lee Tendrick was hinted at yesterday evening about the role of common standards. I've always argued that standards as epitomized in the US, are seen as an alternative to regulation, and in the EU, epitomized as being a driver of, or rather as a tool for regulation. I don't think either are true. I think standards offer an opportunity for different parties to work together without harmonizing, without agreeing on everything, but where they've got a common bedrock through common standards to be able to have dialogues, to be able to work together, to interoperate systems. Look at things like standards around electrical vehicle charging stations, for example. If it had been purely the private sector that had driven this, then we'd be in one of those sort of Betamax versus VHF situations, and possibly ending up with the VHS version, the poorer version of a standard. So sometimes standards are there that help us all. I do, with a certain amount of self-critique, comment often about the irony of the European Union's, or at least some branches of the European Union, notably the European Commission, their response to the Biden administration's and Congress's Inflation Reduction Act. Suddenly, Europe was getting so shocked, and that the US was subsidizing vehicles and parts of the supply chain for cars and vehicles, and that this was unfair. This was state aid. And I sort of thought, well, that's not normally the songbook we sing from. But what it highlighted for me, and this comes into my fourth point, is that the European Union is not just a single entity. On the initial response to the Inflation Reduction Act, it was the European Commission speaking, saying we don't like this and we've got some concerns about it. When the European Parliament was asked about it, it said, bring it on. We're doing the same sort of thing. Let's both try and invest in clean energy for the future for all our sakes, and let's try and build on that. And then the third part of the sort of institutional triangle in the European Union, which represents the member states, the European Council, was completely divided, because some of the member states were heavily invested with China in the Belt and Road project. Others were much more pro-US. Others were trying to invest inwardly within the European Union. But what it demonstrated for me, and this is my final point, is the importance of people. It's whatever the institutional label you carry, the fact of getting off your butt, crossing the Atlantic, talking with people, working with people, getting to understand and walking a mile in somebody else's shoes, understand what it is that drives them, I think is the absolute essential element to the transatlantic partnership. Ironically, COVID gave us an opportunity. You know, meetings were locked down, transatlantic visits, delegation meetings, everything were off the table. So what we did, we pivoted, and in our office, for example, in Washington, where I was working in the European Parliament's bureau there, we decided to deploy technology to its best and start setting up Zoom meetings between senators, House reps, and members of the European Parliament on a regular basis, sometimes 2-3 times a week with different people. And what we found was the conversations went much more deep than they did in these sort of very formal once-a-year delegations where people meet for 2 or 3 days. There's an insane program of activities where you barely get to introduce anybody before your time's running out. And we found that was, I would say, that was instrumental to a much deeper understanding of different points of view on either sides of the Atlantic.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Peter. That was a terrific overview. And one of the issues, Peter, that you raised is the complicated issue of international standards, something that's of great importance to the people, I think, here and globally. Let me open up a question for everybody, because it touches. One of the great difficulties on standards, particularly coming from the United States, where we have traditionally believed in industry and private sector-led standards making, is what is the appropriate role of government? Mm-hmm. As China has increasingly been active in the standards making, there's been calls for the government to help industry play a more active role, resource issues and the like. What are your views about what that relationship between the government, whether it's the US government or European governments, and industry and others in global standards making? Maybe, Wolfgang, maybe I can start with you.
Well, I think there's a role for governments, now at least. I'm coming from a country which benefited from global standards enormously. I mean, Germany was a standard setter in many industries, chemistry, automobile, electronics, even before the two world wars, before standards were really established. So we believe in standards, and we believe in industry-led standards. So let the government not speak about standards. But what we are observing at the moment is, as you rightly described, I mean, the Chinese are really fully coordinated, and they're putting so much resource into it that I think a coordination on a state level between the US and Europe and even some funds would make sense. Otherwise, we get also a technological division. We can't accept these fully Chinese-led standards.
Meredith, you focused on standards, particularly from a trade perspective and a trade barrier perspective. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not quite as optimistic of us bridging with the Europeans, at least at this point. I mean, they're pretty dug in on, Theory Britain talks about the European approach, and if the U.S. wants to jump on board, all the better, and we're welcome to. But I think the TTC negotiators would have loved to shown in a lot of other areas where we could have coordinated standards. And we did get this EV thing, but it was hopefully in the next two meetings of the TTC, they may be able to find some other ones. But I think US and Europe are very far apart in a lot of standards, and the Europeans are pretty negative about accepting our standards that we believe are derived in internationally based organizations. So Europe is, in my view, is going to have to express a little more good faith in wanting to bridge with the U.S. rather than just waiting for the U.S. to want to reset things and go the European way.
Jennifer, if I could turn to you. Companies come to you at the State Department asking for help all the time. That's partly why you're there, including in the standards area. And I know you've raised the question about what the appropriate role ought to be. From a U.S. government official perspective, how do you see standards making what seems to be the realm of the possible, the role of NIST, the Department of Commerce, and other parts of the government?
So I first of all, I spend nearly every engagement with the private sector, and you heard me say this recently, encouraging more participation in standards making bodies. I think the U.S., especially the U.S. private industry, stepped away from it for too long. And in fact, if we want to continue to uphold what we think is the most important thing, which is multi-stakeholder approaches to internet governance, then the U.S. private sector has to be there. And we would support the European private sector being there, but since I represent the U.S. government, I focus on the U.S. private sector. So I think continuing to push, and this idea that you can't just be the market dominant player and say the world will come around to our standard. You need to show up, you need to do the hard work, you need to be negotiating in these locations, you need to be participating in whether it's ITU or 3GGP or whatever it is. U.S. industry needs to be present, because if we're not, then ultimately we're just going to keep falling behind, because what the rest of the world wants, if you take the U.S. and Europe out of it, maybe Japan, what Africa wants is they want an international standard. They want something that's been agreed, that maybe they had a seat at the table, even if they didn't have a lot to say. So I think continuing to create that momentum and participation, I think we've really seen, I would say, a turnabout in the last couple of years, and a realization that ceding the ground for so long was really an unfortunate decision. And I think if we in Europe can come together, all the better. I think there will be areas where we should continue to try to not fight it out in international organizations, that we should do it behind closed doors, which really is most of what's going on with the TTC. And since I have the mic, I will just again say, I think this idea that we do not raise digital regulations, that we are not pushing on EUCS, the AI Act, Digital Markets Act, I think is just wrong. As the only person sitting at this table who actually represent the US government, I don't want anyone here walking away saying the US government does not go in and defend US companies. It's just wrong. And the amount of conversations we have had both with the with the Commission, the Parliament, member states on particularly the legislation that has yet to be passed, which is EUCS, AI Act, and we haven't even talked about network usage fees, is incredible, our engagement on that. And we have put down multiple markers on both DSA and DMA to say, look, we need to see how this is implemented, and if it's implemented in a discriminatory measure, we will continue to engage. So I just do want to end, I want to say that because we now have had 2 speakers who don't actually represent the executive branch saying the executive branch is not engaging on this. So it just,
Well, let me just follow up, and then we're going to go to Peter. Along those lines, have you seen a change in the dynamics of those discussions that you just talked about as a result of China, A, which people have been talking a lot about, but also B, which has been raised on our panel already, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and the ripple effects that has had geopolitically? Are you seeing in those discussions a greater call to unity and bridging those differences in those private conversations, or is it pretty similar the way it's been for the past 5 or 10 years?
I think it really depends on the regulation you're referring to. I think if anything, the invasion of Ukraine really reinforced Europe's view on DSA and the importance of DSA. Look, I was living in Europe during the invasion of Ukraine, so I can speak to this, which is that the actions taken to remove Russian content from websites, et cetera, would never occur in the United States. And I think it reinforced this belief that there was not enough being done on content moderation. And so I think for that, it's not helpful if you really want to defend freedom of speech and the US approach on these issues. I think AI Act is extremely, extremely complicated, and I can't yet say whether or not it's going to make a difference. I think we're hoping we'll be able to get to, the trilogue and negotiations. I mean, there's just, what they say, and I do think this is true, is there are just so many moving pieces, and the AI Act is going to be, I think, will be interesting to see, where it ends up. I think the big difference is where you've seen Europe really take a stronger stance has been on issues related not to this, but the question of implementing the Europe's own 5G toolbox. They had it. They talk about it. There wasn't a lot of internal application of it, and you've seen over the last year increasing rhetoric around it, increasing push, and I think part of that is around this question of, this idea of balancing and the fact that, China can be, somebody with whom you're working when in fact China is supporting Russia in the invasion of Ukraine, I think is very difficult.
Peter, let me turn to you. You raised the question of standards, and you've looked at this for quite a long time. What is the path forward between industry, government, and government both in terms of European government and the US government?
It's a big ask, but
that's why I asked it.
I know. So I think I'll go back to a couple of first principles. I mean, I've been involved in standards work for too long. Anyone and everyone can set requirements. Standards are an encapsulation, a formalized encapsulation of some set of requirements. Those requirements do not come exclusively from the private sector. They come from the voluntary sector, they come from pressure groups, organizations, and they come from government. I mean, in the European Union, I don't know the figures for the US, but the total the total spend in the economy of government public spending is something like 16% of GDP in the European Union. So the European governments, as well as the EU as a set of institutions, are a major player in laying down requirements, because there is, and that's the second important thing about standards from first principles, there has to be a market need. Nobody develops standards for their own sake. Some would argue that some of the European standards bodies do, and I might actually agree with them, but generally standards don't get developed unless there is a proven market need to solve a particular problem. So people come to the table with their requirements and try to deal with that. I think there are two big problems at the moment. Jennifer's addressed one of them, about US industry sort of having taken a bit of a backseat in international standards work. And I'm glad to see, I remember, I think it was Senator Warner had introduced in his Technology Democracy Partnership Bill, a specific requirement, I think it was addressed to State Department, saying we've got to train people on how to do standards work and standards diplomacy. And I applaud that sort of approach. I think we need more of that. I witnessed in the last 15 years the growth of China as an actor in international standards, and it scares the bejesus out of me. Just in sheer force of numbers, they're able to drown out certain working groups, but it's thanks to the consensus-based model that most of the standards bodies work on that stuff gets done, because it's not because you've got 25 people in a room from one country in a room of 30 people that you get your way, because each member organization has one vote. But even when you have a vote, you have to defend your position. You can't just say, I object. You have to have a reasoned objection to a consensus being established. So that sort of diplomacy of how standards are developed and what they are for, I think is critical for all to do. My second point, and my final one, is, and there's a certain amount of sort of EU navel gazing going on, and my concern is have a little bit of humility here. The model of, and you said what comments I have on standards, mine are generally heretical, and here they are specifically heretical and do not represent anything that the European Union institutions would say. My view is the existence of the European standardization system itself is an excuse to China to do the same. There is no justification for there being European-specific standards on global problems. There is a subset of EU standards or standardization work that needs to be done. In the same way, there's a subset of stuff that has to be done within ANSI or under ANSI's umbrella in the US. But for us to defend that model and say that European standards somehow special because they're protecting our economy gives China a blank check to do the same. And I think we have to be very careful about that.
Terrific. We have time perhaps for one question from the audience. If there's someone, I know that there are microphones. We have a question here. Now all we need is a microphone. Oh, I see a microphone coming from the dessert table over here.
Yeah, why don't we get any desserts up here?
Yeah.
You've got to work for us.
They didn't want one.
Yeah. Let the record say that the panel didn't get their desserts.
Oh, we got our just desserts.
Behind you. Right.
Hello, thank you for an excellent panel. My name is Teresa Fallon. I have a question for the whole panel, but especially for Wolfgang. You mentioned kind of briefly how Huawei is still in German networks and they continue to grow. So I find this completely shocking, especially when we talk about the EU's 5G toolbox. And France, for example, has just recently landed the Peace Cable, which is a Huawei cable that goes from Pakistan to North Africa to the south of France. So just being a member of NATO, you have to guarantee that you have secure communications. How do you square this by having China in the network and Huawei continues to establish facts on the ground? How do you square this for security reasons? Thank you.
Well, first of all, it's not growing, it's shrinking all over with all the German operators. Second, what we are, and I think also our competitors have done, but they are not yet finished. There's no Chinese technology in the core networks. So what we are seeing is Chinese technology. Oh, we are getting some dessert. We are seeing Chinese technologies mainly only in the antenna piece. And there are some software issues around which are currently being resolved. And as I said, we are moving from these single run antennas, which do not exist over here in the US, and I'm not going to explain this, to open run developments. And I think it's a matter of time when all of this will be replaced. And speaking about NATO, I mean, we are covering, of course, a lot of NATO bases in Germany, especially Ramstein and Wiesbaden, where your headquarters is, biggest headquarter in Europe. That's all without Huawei. They are all Huawei free. So we take care of these, even where we think it's not a big security issue, because an antenna is an antenna. We take care of that.
Can I just add one quick follow-up, if that's okay? Just one quick one.
Can we turn on the micro? Thanks. I think you're on now. I think you're on.
Okay. There are Horizon
Thank you so much.
funds, and I knew of one particular
Thank
one
you so
where
much.
Huawei was getting it, but the Financial Times revealed a few months ago that they were receiving 11 Huawei Horizon funds. So it's incredible because everyone wants this money, but it seems that European taxpayers are funding Huawei research, and I just find that hard to understand. So maybe someone on the panel can help explain why. Perhaps Peter, thanks.
All right, Peter, explain
Well,
it.
okay, there's an open invitation. So firstly, and this is not my get out of jail free card. Well, I suppose it is, I'm going to use it. The European Parliament doesn't determine where the funds get spent. That's the European Commission. Parliament has oversight of that budget and has been critical of this, and much more so than I would say the European Commission has. But I think back to your original question, there is an additional issue in Europe, and I think I hinted on that in my opening remarks. The difference in what the EU can do at a European level, and what is the responsibility of the member states. I mean, just in the same way you've got state rights versus federal in the US, the member states have not wanted the EU to get involved in certain issues, which is why some countries are closer aligned to China's Belt and Road project. I mean, without calling out name, well, I will, yeah. So France, Germany, Italy, Greece, Cyprus. They are much more invested in protecting or ensuring some longevity for their investments there with China than others who will take a much more principled stand. And that's just the reality of the fact that most of the economic activity in the European Union is generated within the individual member states and not by diktat from the European Union institutions in Brussels.
Jennifer, if I could interrupt the wonderful dessert for just a moment. I'm going to let you have the last word, if you don't mind, because I'm going to let you talk about, for a moment, how important this issue is for the U.S. government. That is the issue of trusted networks and the like.
Well, I would just say it is critically important. It is something that we spend, if you want to talk about how much time do we spend on various issues, this one is high up on the agenda. Look, we think it's a national security threat for every country in the world to be dependent upon Huawei and ZTE. We have, examples that have been shown around the world of, backdoors and other things, essentially, or even just, we would say, not even a backdoor. Sometimes you can just walk through the front door to obtain data, and that every country in the world should be considering this. And we recognize that, of course, there's a huge cost difference between Huawei, ZTE, and Ericsson, Nokia, and Samsung. And that is one of the reasons why, while prioritizing trusted networks, we are also focused on the development of Open RAN. Because whether Open RAN is a technology of today or a technology of tomorrow, and I'm not a techie, so I really refuse to determine which one it is going to be at least the technology of tomorrow, which means that will create vendor diversification, which we hope will bring down the cost of deploying trusted technology. And so that's why we think Open RAN is important, but it's not the primary purpose. The primary purpose is that we think countries around the world should be able to protect their information be able to not be at the mercy of somebody in the PRC deciding to shut off a data center or a wireless network, and that you should essentially continue to invest in trusted telecommunications. David and I were talking last night about semiconductor production around the world, and I can tell you this is something that companies that are deploying semiconductor production care about. Is their intellectual property going to be siphoned off via the telecommunications sector or not? And so ultimately, when you think about competitive advantages, that is one of them that we have in the United States from having decided to devote the money to get untrusted suppliers out of our telecommunications networks, which clearly has a cost. But ultimately, when you have to weigh the cost-benefit analysis between national security and economics in the United States, we 99% of the time put national security first. And I think we encourage countries around the world to do the same, and we've been trying to collaborate and are collaborating with European officials, whether they're through the EU missions or Sweden and Finland in particular, because essentially what we're spending all of our time doing, and let's be clear, is promoting Nokia and Ericsson, and a little bit Samsung, but mostly Nokia and Ericsson. Because this is not about U.S. economic development, this is about national security.
Well, I think I mentioned about a cost-benefit analysis is a perfect way at a TPI Aspen forum to end. Let us thank the panel, and let me thank you all for staying through this. Thank you very much.
It's a little one.
Just a bit.
little?
You don't want to exert. Cool you down.
That's now a hot cake.
Ooh, they haven't. Okay, good. Thank you.